recent years. I feel a bit as if I'm here on false pretenses, because although I've written a book about Australia in the Great Depression, I very deliberately tried to make it a national history. So although I did mention Brunswick on a number of occasions, I can't claim to have written a book about Brunswick in the Great Depression, and I imagine there are some people in this audience who know a lot more about Brunswick's history than I do, so please interject if you wish. I want to start really with just the big picture. What was wrong with Australia during the Great Depression? The problem was that the Australian economy was very small and heavily dependent on a few select exports, of which our dear friend, the merino ram and other sheep products was one. We also had a very heavy reliance on exporting wheat and, to a lesser extent, meat and gold. And I simply include these images because, to me, it was quite interesting to see the distribution of those industries across Australia. And there was one point I want to make very clearly in the book, is that you can't talk about Australia's experience of the Great Depression. It is very localised, and it differs from place to place. Now, the problem for Australia was that it had a reliance on these commodities. And I don't know if you can see this graph. This is what happened to wheat and wool prices between 1928 and 1938. And I don't think the little thing is working, but you'll see the crash that occurred in wheat and wool prices for complex reasons in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And the real dilemma was that Australian governments, particularly state governments, had borrowed very heavily on the London money market through issuing bonds in order to build infrastructure largely. And if you wander down these suburbs, not just here of course, but where I live out near Albion Street and the freeway, you'll see street after street of houses that were built in the 1920s and which were serviced with sewerage, electricity and other facilities. The problem was that as the wheat prices collapsed, it became very difficult for Australia to service even the interest on the money it had borrowed in London. And the other problem for the Australian economy, which particularly affected Brunswick, was that its manufacturing industry was not very robust. It certainly wasn't a very great export industry, and it could not compete as strongly as it should have with imports. And so this is really what caused the crunch for Brunswick. Now, in 1930, there were over 300 factories in Brunswick. This is one of them, which still exists in Donald Street. It was called the Prestige, I think, Textile Factory. It produced clothing and hosiery and so on. 63 of the factories in Brunswick were textile industries, and of course these were great employers of women. The textile industry, for reasons largely to do with the protection that was offered to Australian industry through tariffs. You know, we had this huge tariffs war around Australia at that stage. The textile industry was one of the first to start pulling out of the Great Depression, fortunately for its employees. But the other problem was that the construction industry absolutely crashed, partly as the rest of the economy contracted. Of course, people didn't have the funds to buy or to service renovations to their homes. And the loans that I mentioned earlier that the state government had taken out had been used for works that were largely construction works. So you see very high levels of unemployment in the brick industries. This, of course, is Hoffman's on Dawson Road, but also the associated industries. By some counts across the country, perhaps 70% of plasterers were unemployed as a result of the crash in the construction industry. And as my slide says, in 1930, the Bricklayers Union in Victoria claimed that 75% of its members were out of work. Now, this may be too small for people at the back, I'm afraid, but this shows the rates that the trade union members were rates of unemployed trade unionists in Victoria. And the very interesting thing is to note that in 1928, unemployment of trade unionists was hitting 11%. And Australia actually was very seriously in recession, even depression, well before the stock market crash of October 1929. It really has very little to do with Australia's crash. Then you'll see the numbers go up to 1932, and they're 26.5% in Victoria, coming down a little and slowly, but still in 1938, 8.6% unemployment. And it's generally considered both by economists and by people who remember the Great Depression that full employment did not come back, and full employment normally means around 4% of unemployment until the Second World War, about 1941. So the memory that some of your parents may have had that it was the war that saved them is actually accurate. So now on to Brunswick. Now Brunswick, as Elizabeth said, was an epicentre of both protest and resistance, and I think resilience as well, the other word in my title. And let me say that the point of my book is really to try and understand how the generation of Australians who survived the Great War, or lived through the Great War, were able to find the capacity to deal with the Great Depression, and then, another 10 years later, the Second World War. I think it's an extraordinary generation of Australians whose sufferings and stoicism makes what we've been through in the pandemic really fail into insignificance. Anyway, there were 4 big issues that led to the eruption of protest in Brunswick. And the first, not surprisingly, was food. The second was what was called relief works. They were the attempts by governments to find work for unemployed men, and so far as they could, for women. There was a great deal of concern that if single women were unemployed, they would have to resort to prostitution or other desperate measures to survive. So governments across Australia tried, so far as they could, to offer programs of employment for unemployed workers. The third big issue, which I'll look at, is the eviction of people from their homes because they could not keep rental payments up, or because they were no longer able to service the mortgage. And one of the great contrasts, I think, between the recent pandemic and the experience of the Great Depression was that, fortunately, recently, banks and governments alike agreed that there should be something of a freeze on mortgage payments, and hence we didn't see that level of people being thrown into the streets with their furniture that we'll see soon in the Great Depression. And finally, there was a great debate about free speech, the right to protest and to criticise government, because the governments across the country were considered by particularly the left wing, but also, I'd have to say, by the right wing also, not to be responding to the Depression in any appropriate way. We can talk more in question time if you wish about why it was so difficult for governments to respond to the Great Depression, to stimulate the economy and to provide employment for those thrown out of work. But they were really very trapped by a number of difficult policy settings, if I can call them that. So now let's go on to the first, the food. Now there was a system called sustenance, which in Australians' inimitable way was immediately shortened to the susso. Now the susso essentially was the entitlement of the unemployed to receive some support in food in the form of rations. And in Victoria, this was passed quite quickly. In 1930, mid-1930, there was an Unemployment Relief Act. Now prior to, this is very significant because this year is really the first year in Australian history where most of the governments accepted that they had some responsibility to help the unemployed. Only Queensland had introduced unemployment insurance in the 1920s. And previously it had been assumed that the responsibility for looking after the poor, as they were called, resided with the charities, what we call the non-government sector. And we'll talk more about those in a moment. But there was also a quite prevailing attitude in the 19th and early 20th century that the poor were poor because of their own fault. So there was this idea that there were the undeserving poor. They were either drunk or they gambled or they didn't work hard enough and didn't follow Protestant work ethics and so on. And what the Depression does, of course, is force everybody, governments and charities alike, to accept that there is structural unemployment. That something goes wrong globally or nationally with the economy, and many people are affected, regardless of their personal qualities or their personal circumstances. So you get these unemployment relief acts passed by all state governments. I mean, this is a time when the Commonwealth government plays a pretty limited role. So the Victorian government passes this relief act and it's amended and changed through the Depression. But it's very interesting that only a small percentage of the money that the Victorian government allocated was for sustenance, £130,000 out of, and another $1 million for relief works, because, as I've indicated, it was assumed that you had to work, you know, an honest man worked. And the idea of working for the dole, I guess, is still with us as one of the beliefs of certain sections of politics. Now, as I've said, the idea was not just that the charities should help the poor, but first of all, the Victorian government thought that the charities should have the responsibility for distributing this sustenance. And how the sustenance worked was that a person who was unemployed had to first register at the Unemployment Bureau. They had to go through regular means tests, you know, why have you not sold your piano if you're coming and begging for food, which many people found very inquisitorial and offensive. But once you'd registered, and you had to do that every fortnight to be eligible for your rations, you went down and got your ration card, and then you went off to a nominated depot or a grocer or a butcher. You weren't allowed to get cash. That was one of the big disputes. And you had to work through this system. The problem was the charities, which were largely made up of people like myself, older middle-class women, had no idea how to manage a relief program on this scale, and they certainly weren't adequately funded to do so. So by July of 1930, and let's say that, you know, unemployment's beginning to soar by the previous year, 1929, July of 1930, the Melbourne Ladies Benevolent Society, which is one of these very, very prominent charities, was already spending double the amount that it was receiving from all its revenue sources, including government, in Brunswick. And that was the crisis that continued. These women got very angry with the government. He told them they weren't working hard enough and there was much goings on. I can't talk a great deal more about that, except to say the system gradually, of course, became amended, and a Minister for Sustenance was appointed. Now, in typical left-wing manner, he was soon dubbed to be the Minister of Starvation, and here we have on the right the man who carried that title with the greatest opprobrium, a man called Wilfred Kent Hughes. He's in his World War I uniform. He actually went on and became prisoner of war with the Japanese in World War II, and wrote a very strange long poem about captivity in Latin verse. Anyway, Wilfred Kent Hughes was quite inclined to be sympathetic to fascism and was not popular with the unemployed. Now, as I've said, there were a lot of problems surrounding the sustenance, and here's a picture from Barnett's collection in the State Library of Victoria, one of the few we have. We have, alas, very few photographs of the Great Depression in Melbourne that I've been able to find, but here you have, I think they're in Carlton, you know, abject poverty. The issues that people argued about was, well, they didn't want to take what was on the list of the sustenance, they wanted to get the cash, and of course the worthy charity said, well, if we give these men cash, you know what they'll do with it, they'll drink it or they'll gamble it. So every now and then the charities or other depots would try and shift to an in-kind distribution. You turned up and you got your packet of flour or your loaf of bread. And what the unemployed did, the radical unemployed did, was blacklist those depots. Now, I've not come across a particular reference to Brunswick, but certainly in Carlton and Richmond, the depots delivering the food were blacklisted, and you had some pretty dreadful scenes where women, who of course were desperate to get food for their children, would break through the picket lines, being hissed and booed by the men who were trying to protest. Another big issue, as I've said, was whether you were eligible. There were all sorts of forms and checks about whether you were entitled to receive sustenance, and these became deeply resented. And the poor officials, of course, managing this scheme, as so often happens to the middle level official, were the ones who got it in the neck when it was really, of course, a matter of government policy. And the problem was that the governments of Australia became through another issues how they got to this point, but they had to eventually cut their expenditure dramatically because Australia was facing national insolvency because of the difficulty of servicing these debts in London and was about to default. And so the budgets contracted just at the very time that the need for major investment in some things like the sustenance grew. And there were also disputes about the quality and variety of the food. I mean, people are quite remarkable, and good on them, you know. They didn't want that cut of meat, they wanted that cut of meat. And the files, the records are full of people arguing with butchers about, you know, what they're being given. And then the first list of rations didn't have much fruit or vegetables in it, and it's to the credit of the medical profession and others in the Melbourne community that they said to the government, look, really, kids need fruit and vegetables. And as I'll say in a moment, the evidence is that the children of Melbourne actually did not suffer dramatic malnutrition, and certainly not starvation. Now, as I've said, the sustenance was never enough because of the constraints on government budget. So we get the charities coming in to supplement government efforts. Now, that is a picture from Sydney. It's the best I've got, but it just shows the length of the queue outside a Salvation Army's soup kitchen. And there were 33 of these approved benevolent societies in Victoria. They had to be approved by a central agency. But beyond that, of course, there were a plethora of church organisations. This is when the Brotherhood of St Lawrence comes to Melbourne. You've got the Salvation Army, you've got St Vincent de Paul, names that are still familiar to us. And I mean, I think the mobilisation of the Australian community was quite remarkable. And one of the reasons I think that Australia proved resilient in the Great Depression was this sort of mobilisation of community effort. Much of it, of course, was driven by middle-class people who felt some sense of obligation, but there were a whole lot of different organisations, by returned soldiers, trade unions, you name it. Everybody lobbied and mobilised. And what they were trying to do was to get more food, more clothing. The Herald ran a big blanket fund so people could get blankets for their children. There were fundraising activities everywhere in order to try and bridge the gap. But all this, as I said, came with an inquisitorial regime. People would suddenly find someone turning up at their doorstep to find out, you know, whether they were cohabiting with somebody when they said they were single, whether they'd got some valuables that they hadn't sold, and some historians would argue that there was a great deal of social control in this whole system. You only got the support if you behaved in the way middle-class charities believed you should. Another thing that, of course, people desperately needed was shelter, and so a lot of these charities provided accommodation for the homeless, a point we'll return to in a moment. But in addition to this, of course, people helped themselves, and if you look at the oral history, the interviews that were done, alas, not until about the 1970s, there's a tremendous sense of pride in what people called making do, you know, getting on, improvising. The mother was a very central figure. Now, here on the left, we've got a mother in a shantytown, I suppose you'd call it, one of these homeless camps that grew up outside Sydney, and there she is tending her vegetables. On the other hand, and this one's from Collingwood, of course, if you lived in one of the working class slums, your chances of growing vegetables in your backyard were not particularly strong. But we do know that across the country, we had a whole kind of exchange economy, you know, people trying to grow things, keep chooks, constantly making whatever they could out of whatever food they got. The rabbit was ubiquitous, and people got very sick of eating a rabbit in its various forms. So you've got this combination of supports: the government sustenance, the community efforts, including the charities, and then I think very fundamentally the efforts of people themselves. And one of the conclusions in my book is that if you had a functioning family, you had a better chance of getting through. And at the heart of that functioning family was often, of course, the mother with all her skills. As one of my favourite books says, Mum looks after the children, she does everything else as well. And that was very much the case for women of this time. I just need to say that there was a great debate about the health of Australians during the Great Depression. And although at the time everybody talked about people starving, the great invocation of the discourse of starvation, there was, so far as we can tell, no significant increase in diseases associated with malnutrition. Unfortunately, the records are not as good as the British records, but still, such data as we have suggests that people continue to die of things like heart disease and cancer rather than diseases that are directly related to lack of food. Significantly, infant mortality declined, and as I've already mentioned, Victoria made provision for expectant mothers and infants and school children to have additional food. A big study was done in Melbourne in 1932 of 43,000 inner suburban children, and found out that anemia and rickets, which you think would be showing up in children, was lower than in the recent past. And height and weight are generally taken as key indicators of children's nutrition. Melbourne children weighed more and were taller in 1937 to 38 than they had been in 1921 to 22. There is, of course, an interesting statistic that we cannot ignore, which is that 1930 was the highest rate of male suicide in the 20th century. Interestingly, it started to dip thereafter. And I could talk more about this in question time if you like. I suspect, we'll never know fully, but I suspect what was going on was a lot of soldiers who had untreated trauma from World War I could not cope, and the next big blow came. Moving on to relief works. As I said, these were offered by governments out of revenue, and they offered men who were unemployed manual work, but it was always part-time and not always at the award rates that the trade unions wanted it to be paid at. So there was a lot of protest around relief works, and particularly in Victoria it got very, the temperature rose dramatically when Wilfred Kent Hughes, the Minister for Starvation, tried to make a direct nexus between receiving the sustenance and going on relief work for the dole. Australian men still had enough in them to really protest and actually refuse, in many instances, to do that kind of relief work. Often, now, there are things all around the city that I found out were built during this time. All the lands around the shrine were built on relief works. And one of the things I was going to suggest to the Brunswick Historical Society is we need to start putting a few plaques out so people know what was done in this period. Most people will say to me, oh, Great Ocean Road. Great Ocean Road was, of course, a war memorial and started in the 20s. It is completed in the Great Depression, as indeed is Sydney Harbour Bridge, which soon became a site for people jumping to their death to commit suicide. One of the things men did not want to do, in many instances, was go on relief works that were outside the city and which obliged them leaving their families. And there was considerable protest around that issue as well. Now, one of the issues that relief works were, one of the sites in which the issue of relief works was played out was the Broad Meadows camp, which is up, I think, near Camp Road, so far as I can tell from my investigations. This had been a training camp during World War I, and as you see, a very cosy place full of corrugated iron huts. And most governments, the Victorian one included, wanted to get men out of the cities. They thought unemployed men were, a real danger to the stability of the body politic. And so they set this up in the Depression, reclaimed the site, as a camp for single men. Well, it soon became, to quote one author, a seething cauldron of disaffection, discord, and unadulterated misery. It was run by a former World War I officer who thought he was running a training camp, getting everybody up early and refusing drink on the premises and so on, and there were a lot of protests and mutinies against his authority. It was called Better Days Camp, but it had bunks with palliasses and, as I said, was run on military lines. And eventually, men sometimes had to be expelled because their behaviour was deemed to be so unacceptable, or else, in many instances, they just got up and walked. And one of the more interesting evacuations or exits from the camp occurred in mid-1931. The commander of the camp, a man called Scanlon, apparently abused a man who was caught removing wood from a kitchen without authority, and about 170 men walked out down Sydney Road, and they ended up at a place, they ended up first in the Coburg Police Office, and then they kept coming down and they ended up in Lydia Street, which is just over from where we are now, at a place called Privateering House. It was the headquarters of the Communist Party at that stage. Now, I've spent some time trying to find out where Privateering House was, and I actually wrote to the Communist Party, which most people say, does it still exist? Yes, it does. And they said, oh, we think it's number 57. It can't be number 57, although this possibly could have been its Victorian house. But a good colleague of mine, Andrew May from the University of Melbourne, did a bit of research, and we think it was number 61, Lydia Street, which alas is now a 1950s villa. But there was there a big hall that was a dance hall, and there is a press report that says that it was called Spring Tara. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that. But there's a press report that says that in mid-1931, and I assume it's the men who left the Broadmeadows camp, there were 80 men sleeping in that hall in Lydia Street. Now that, of course, leads us to our next question, which is evictions. Homelessness was a major and catastrophic feature of the Great Depression. And essentially what happened was that people couldn't pay their rent, so the landlord went to a magistrate and got a warrant to evict them. And the poor landlord, I say the poor landlord and the estate agent because they did actually get abused, as I'll show you in a moment, would go and try and evict the person or the family from the property. And in 1931, just to give you some sense of scale, there were 692 warrants executed. A lot more granted, but only 692 executed. That is actually, people thrown out of their homes. 1932, 1,651 in Melbourne. Now, as you can imagine, these evictions became the site of great protest. This picture is actually from Sydney. I don't, alas, have one for Melbourne. But what used to happen was the news would go around that an eviction was about to occur, and anyone who wanted to join the protest would come, but the core of the protest tended to be members of a movement called the Unemployed Workers' Movement, which was a Communist Party front. And so we get stories like in Gold Street in Brunswick. Now, alas, they just said it was a semi-detached brick house, so I just took a picture of a semi-detached brick house of Gold Street, because the press reports, alas, don't tell us the numbers. But a woman with 3 children was evicted, and the estate agent and bailiff were then attacked by a crowd of about 500 unemployed men who, quote, poured into the house from all points. That's the press report. And she said, my husband left me 7 weeks ago, and since then I've not been able to pay the £1 a week rent. I have nowhere to go, and how can I take 3 young children into the streets? Well, these evictions would lead to other actions, and our town hall, just around the corner, became a bit of a dumping ground or a site for protest. Furniture was sometimes, when it was dumped in the street, brought down to the town hall, and one, I loved this one, message on the town hall was, he was an Anzac who fought for his home in 1915, evicted 1931. That sense that I fought for the country and then look what you're doing to me. But let me say that one of the really striking things about the Melbourne Local Council records, and fortunately they are very rich, much richer than anything I could find for other capital cities, is that the council really tried, I think, to advocate on behalf of the unemployed. The trouble for the councils was that they were expected to deliver all these services by the state and federal government, but their own rate revenue, as you can imagine, was crashing because people weren't able to pay the rates. So there's many, many accounts of the mayor or local councillors trying to advocate on behalf of their residents with the state government. The problem with the councils too was when money was available for relief works, they normally had to match the pound provided by the state government or the federal government with a pound from their own revenue. And one of the interesting things is that, as the Mayor of Brunswick said on one occasion, not all landlords were what we would call fat cats. There were lots of people who had properties and were dependent upon the rent for their own well-being. So, yes, there was certainly a massive inequality of wealth in Australia, but not all of the landlords were these rapacious extractors of grinding money out of the poor. One of the strategies that was used when evictions occurred was to come back afterwards, gangs of the unemployed would come back afterwards and wreck the house. So here's a wonderful quote which I'll read because you can't read it from the back. This is in Rose Street, very close to where I live. And the tenant had been a returned soldier again. And this is the press report of the trashing of the property. Fittings were smashed, doors wrenched from their hinges, seals and walls damaged, windows broken, grates torn from fireplaces and gas fittings broken. Glass was strewn over the floor, there were holes in the ceilings and walls, and big stones and bits of fencing were thrown around the room. The gang hooted the estate agent and placarded the pillars of the town hall with notices that this agent had evicted the tenant. Later they threw bricks through the plate glass windows of the estate agent's offices. I guess I won't find that house in Rose Street because it doesn't look like there was much left of it. Now the final and probably the most famous protest in Brunswick was about free speech. Because, of course, people said we have the right to complain and to protest and to demand better conditions. And there were, because of the anger, the frustration and the desperation of many of the poor, a lot of violent clashes between protesters and police. And on the left we have our, not one of my favourite people, but nonetheless a very important man in Australian history, Thomas Blamey. He would go on to become Commander-in-Chief of Australian forces during World War II. I think he's the only one who's ever given a Field Marshal back. Anyway, Blamey was then Commissioner of the Victorian Police. And he was probably a member of one of these paramilitary organisations called the White Army, and he was, like so many conservative people of this time, deeply anti-communist. He thought that communism was going to ruin society. So he set up special squads to investigate communist activities during the Great Depression and to try and break up public gatherings, marches and meetings, particularly by the unemployed workers movement, which, as I said, was led by communists. And people have spoken about the trail of broken heads and bruised bodies that the Victorian police left after some of the protests. And all of this came to the head in our Phoenix Street, literally 2 minutes walk up Sydney Road. Now, Blamey decided the Phoenix Street had been used and had long had a tradition of being a great place for public meetings, particularly on Friday nights, because they even had late night shopping then. And so this became the place where many protests were held. And Blamey just wanted to have quite severe powers to restrict public protests, but he was not given them. And so he invoked the Traffic Act, and he said the problem with these protesters is they're blocking the street. Well, if you know Phoenix Street, it goes down to the railway line. And so people said, well, there's no traffic anyway, so how could we be blocking the street? Still, the police kept making multiple arrests in 1932, particularly 1933, including even the acting premier. Lots of politicians were arrested, so it wasn't just, what Blamey would have thought was the rat bag element. All of this culminated in the middle of 1933 when the young artist Noel Coonahan decided to provoke the police, and he got himself locked into a cage and put on the back of a truck, and he was wheeled into Phoenix Street while his friend Shorty Patullo jumped on a tram and taunted the police to follow him. Well, they did. He siphoned the police away, but for his pains, when he jumped off the tram, he was chased down the street and shot in the thigh. But meanwhile, Cunahan was in his cage, and the police couldn't get in. They were actually trying to get into the cage. And Cunahan managed to give a 25-minute speech about the iniquities of the government. Cunahan was a communist, and the crowd was chanting, as Australian crowds would, you know, "Out you bastards, out," he said to the police. And finally, Cunahan was extracted from the cage. He was fined, but the fine was later quashed. Patullo, poor man with the shot leg, was fined and jailed for a month. Now, we do have this very grainy photograph, anyone can come and have a look at it later, supposedly of Cunahan in the cage. I'm pretty certain it must have been staged later. I mean, it doesn't look like it's in Phoenix Street, but it does attempt to depict this very, very notorious occasion. And it was actually in the end a victory for the protesters, because the Victorian government passed a new Street Meetings Act. I mean, there were many other people in the community who thought free speech was a right, and that had to be protected. And the protesters were given freedom from conviction if, quote, not causing undue obstruction, given the amount of traffic. Now, as you may know, we have a little monument to the free speech movement, though, as I said in my book, you'd be hard-pressed to know what it is. I tried it out on my daughter today. I said, "What do you think this commemorates?" Well, so far as I can see, I mean, it's just there, literally outside the Mechanics Institute. And it commemorates the Mechanics Institute also. It's got the tools and a book on it. It looks to me like a cage with a nightcloth over it, but the bird's got out, and the bird is free. So that's the memorial to free speech in Victoria. There are few other memorials to the Great Depression. I wrote to lots of historical societies writing the book. They couldn't find any. I had a colleague who wandered all around Perth, and I actually think it's time we started to mark some of these more exciting parts of our past. Well, let me conclude, because we've got time for questions. There was constant resistance and, I think, remarkable resilience in Brunswick, as elsewhere in Australia. And what I argued in the book is that I think actually the protest and the resistance was part of the resilience. I think it gave people a great sense of agency, you know, to get out there in a crowd, shouting, "Out bastards, out you bastards, out," was, I think, something of a safety valve in Australian society. And even though the police responded often with violence, there was, I mean, it wasn't the kind of regime, repressive regime that you would, for example, have seen in Nazi Germany. I mean, people would get perhaps fined or sent to jail for a short period of time. Some left-wing historians have been concerned. They think the working class was rather quiescent. I don't think there's a lot of evidence to support that. I mean, obviously there were many people for whom unemployment, particularly long-term employment, was a cause of great personal depression and inactivity. But there was, as I said, a lot of localised protest. However, and one of my colleagues called me deeply conservative for saying this, but I'll stand by it. I don't see in the Great Depression any protest either on the left wing of politics or on the right wing. And of course there were paramilitary movements like the Old Guard and the New Guard and the White Army. I don't see any coherent systemic attempt to overthrow the political order. Essentially, even Labour politicians, well, probably not the small Communist Party, but they were very small, but very few people on the left thought they were bringing about the destruction of the system. They were prepared to operate within the democratic traditions of protest, elections, and free speech. And so for all the suffering and all the distress, and it was, let me say, concentrated in particular areas, the manufacturing working classes, the other industries that working class people were employed in, and in the country, the wheat industry particularly, there was a great deal of devastation and suffering. But for all of that, remarkably, there is no revolution. And what we've got to remember is that World War I, and then the Depression that followed, did bring about some of the most violent authoritarian regimes in Europe. And I ended up with a quite sentimental attachment to Australia, that we managed as a community to endure this succession of crises in a way that still kept our political institutions and our social fabric intact. Thank you. Now, I think the idea is you put your hand up if you have a question, and Heidi has a microphone.
Oh, thank you. I just want to mention, as I think it's important, the name of the sculptor who did